On the night of January 22nd, 1944, a German coastal defender south of Rome went to sleep the way he had gone to sleep on dozens of nights before, with a reasonable expectation that nothing would happen before dawn. His sector, a stretch of beach near the town of Anzio, was thinly held. The nearest serious reserves were miles away. He had been told, correctly, that any Allied landing would need daylight to organize the naval gunfire, the air cover, and the sheer administrative complexity of putting tens of thousands of men and their equipment ashore in the right place at the right time. Amphibious invasions, in his understanding of how war worked, were morning events. He woke to find the beach already gone. Not gone in the sense of being contested, gone in the sense of having ceased hours earlier to be a meaningful line at all. British and American troops had come ashore in darkness, moved inland before the sun rose, and by the time anyone in the German chain of command had a clear picture of what was happening, the landing was no longer a landing. It was already a beachhead, and a nearly undefended one. The after-action reports written by German officers in the following days share a specific tone. Not panic and not quite embarrassment, something closer to professional disorientation. The invasion had not failed to follow the rules, it had ignored them. And the officers writing those reports had spent their careers being trained to expect that the rules would hold. This happened more than once. It would keep happening in different forms for the rest of the war. And the pattern it revealed says something specific about how two armies had come to think about darkness, not as an absence of fighting, but as a resource, and about which side had figured that out first. For almost the entire history of organized warfare, night was when the fighting stopped. This was not sentiment. It was physics and psychology working together in a way that made large-scale night combat close to impossible for most of human history. An army before the 20th century had no way to communicate across a battlefield in the dark, except by voice, by runner, or by fire, none of which worked well when units were spread over open ground and visibility dropped to a few yards. Formations that depended on soldiers being able to see the men beside them and officers being able to see their formations simply came apart in darkness. Friendly units fired on each other. Reserves marched into the wrong sector. Commanders lost the ability to know in any meaningful sense where their own army was. So armies camped at night and fought during the day. And this arrangement held with only minor exceptions for thousands of years. Even the more sophisticated night operations of earlier wars, a raiding party, a surprise assault on a sleeping garrison, were almost always small-scale by design, because the same darkness that hid the attacker also made it nearly impossible for him to coordinate anything larger than a company. The First World War changed this only partially. Trench raids at night became a routine, brutal feature of the Western Front, small parties slipping across no man's land to snatch prisoners or destroy a position before slipping back before dawn. But these were surgical actions, not the general method of attack. When armies wanted to break through a line, they still did it in daylight, behind a barrage, because a full-scale infantry assault still needed officers who could see their men and artillery observers who could see their targets. By the time the Second World War began, radio had solved part of the coordination problem that had made night combat so difficult, but it had not solved the harder part. A radio could tell a company commander where his platoons were supposed to be. It could not tell an artillery observer what he was looking at, and it could not stop two friendly units from stumbling into each other in a cratered field at 2 in the morning. Night combat remained, for both sides, a genuinely dangerous and unreliable tool, one used sparingly for specific and limited purposes by commanders who understood exactly how easily it could go wrong. The German army understood this as well as anyone. It had, if anything, more institutional experience with night operations than most of its opponents.
Infiltration tactics developed in the First World War had depended on small groups moving under cover of darkness and poor visibility to slip past strongpoints before a main assault. But those tactics were always the exception that supported a daylight plan, not a substitute for one. By 1943, facing the Americans in North Africa and then in Italy, German commanders still expected that when a large operation came, it would be organized around what daylight made possible: aerial reconnaissance to confirm dispositions, observed artillery fire to shape the ground before an assault, and coordinated combined arms attacks that depended on officers actually being able to see the battlefield they were fighting on. What they had not fully priced in was that for the American army, several of those daylight advantages had quietly turned into daylight liabilities.
The reasoning that pushed American commanders toward the night was not romantic, it was arithmetic, and it changed depending on the year and the theater, but a few threads ran through nearly every case. The first was observation. German artillery in Italy and later in France was frequently sighted on high ground with excellent daylight fields of view: the mountains around Cassino, the bluffs above the Rapido River, the ridgelines overlooking the beaches south of Rome. An American unit that tried to cross open ground in daylight within range of those positions was moving through terrain that had already been measured, ranged, and registered by German gunners who could watch every step of the advance and adjust fire onto it in real time. That same ground, crossed at night, denied the observer the one thing his entire fire support system depended on: the ability to see. The second was air power, and its weight shifted over the course of the war. In North Africa and the early Italian campaign, the German Air Force was still a real threat to American formations massing for an attack. A column of trucks or a beachhead full of landing craft was a target daylight made easy to find and easy to hit. Moving and landing under cover of darkness reduced that exposure substantially. Later in the war, as Allied air superiority became overwhelming, this particular argument for night operations weakened. American forces increasingly used daylight specifically because their own air cover made it safe to do so. But the habit of using darkness to approach, position, and achieve the first moments of surprise persisted even after the original reason for it had partly disappeared, because commanders had learned a broader lesson. Darkness bought you the first hour of a fight before the enemy could organize a coherent response, and that first hour was often the one that decided everything else. The third reason was the hardest for German defenders to fully anticipate, because it depended on trusting the same distributed, bottom-up style of leadership that had shown up in the markings on American helmets. Night attacks are harder to control from the top. They require small units, platoons, sometimes squads, to navigate, maintain contact with each other, and make decisions without the close daylight supervision an officer could otherwise provide. An army whose junior leaders had been trained to act on their commander's intent rather than wait for detailed instruction was, for exactly this reason, better positioned to attempt night operations at scale than an army whose doctrine still assumed decisions flowed from the top down. The Americans could ask their sergeants to lead a platoon across a river in the dark, trust that those sergeants would improvise when the plan inevitably came apart in the confusion, and be reasonably confident the attack would still cohere by morning. That confidence itself was a kind of weapon, and it was one that could not simply be copied by an army whose institutional habits ran the other way. The pattern showed up early, and it kept showing up. The invasion of Sicily in July of 1943 began with airborne troops dropped in darkness, badly scattered by wind and inexperience, but landing hours before German coastal defenders had any organized picture of what was happening. The amphibious landings that followed at dawn were themselves the product of an approach made under cover of night, with the invasion fleet closing on the coast in darkness specifically to deny German observers the hours of warning that a daylight approach would have given them. At Anzio, the pattern repeated with even sharper effect, precisely because the German defenses there were thin enough that darkness turned a difficult landing into an almost unopposed one. The initial landing succeeded so completely and so quietly that some American units later described the strange sensation of walking inland in the dark without encountering any resistance at all, an experience that left commanders more anxious than reassured, since an unopposed landing usually meant the enemy was regrouping somewhere out of sight rather than beaten. River crossings became the other great proving ground for the tactic. In September of 1944, as Patton's Third Army approached the Moselle River near Dornot and Arneville, American engineers and infantry crossed at night in small rubber assault boats, feeling their way across water that German positions on the far bank had spent days preparing to defend in daylight. The crossings were bloody and imperfect. Night crossings against alert defenders rarely went cleanly, and units on the far bank often spent the following hours simply trying to re-establish contact with each other in terrain none of them could see. But the alternative, a daylight crossing directly into prepared and observed defensive fire, was calculated to be worse, and commanders on both sides understood exactly why. The largest and most consequential of these operations came in March of 1945, when Patton's forces crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim on the night of March 22nd. German commanders further north, watching for the expected major crossing near Wesel, where British and American forces were visibly massing in daylight for a set-piece operation, were caught almost entirely by surprise by a crossing executed quietly at night by units that had spent the preceding days deliberately avoiding the kind of visible daylight preparation that would have given the operation away. By the time German reserves understood what had happened and where, American forces were already established on the eastern bank in strength, and the crossing that field marshals further north had been elaborately preparing to defend against had already happened somewhere else.
What did German defenders actually learn from all this in the accumulated experience of fighting an enemy who kept doing this to them? The first thing they learned was that the normal rhythm of the front line, a rough, unspoken agreement that serious attacks came with daylight and nights were for resupply, evacuation of wounded, and repair of defenses, could not be relied upon. German infantry manuals of the period had always allowed for the possibility of night attack, but they treated it as an exceptional tactic, used for specific, limited objectives, a raid, an infiltration to seize a single position before dawn, a small-scale action meant to set up the following day's larger effort. What German units in Italy and France increasingly encountered was an enemy willing to conduct full-scale operations, river crossings, amphibious landings, sometimes entire divisional attacks under cover of darkness as a matter of routine method, not occasional expedient. The second thing they learned was more expensive to absorb because it required changing behavior that had become habitual. Positions that had been sited for excellent daylight fields of fire needed, it turned out, an entirely separate set of preparations for the hours when those fields of fire were useless. Listening posts pushed further forward, flares kept in constant supply and constant readiness, patrols sent out not to gather intelligence, but simply to prevent an American unit from walking undetected into the gaps between strongpoints. German defensive doctrine had always included provisions for this. What changed was the frequency with which those provisions actually needed to be used, and the toll that frequency took on units that were, by 1944, increasingly under strength and increasingly exhausted. The third lesson was the hardest one, and it went back to the same institutional gap that had shown up at Kasserine and in the markings on American helmets. A German defensive position that lost contact with its higher headquarters in the middle of a night attack faced a specific and serious problem. The men actually in the position had been trained, for the most part, to hold and report and wait for direction, not to improvise a defense against a threat that hadn't been anticipated and that no one above them yet understood. An American night attack that succeeded in breaking the first line of communication, cutting a field telephone wire, overrunning a forward observation post, did not just remove a position from the map. It removed, for a period of hours that could prove decisive, a piece of the decision-making apparatus that the German defense depended on, at exactly the moment darkness had already made independent decision-making by everyone else nearly impossible.
There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from never being sure the fighting has actually stopped. And by the later years of the war, German units on the Italian and Western fronts were suffering from a great deal of it. Soldiers accustomed to a rough daily rhythm, contact during daylight, a tense but genuine lull after dark, had to relearn, unit by unit, that the lull could not be trusted. Diaries and interrogation reports from captured German soldiers in this period describe a specific and recurring complaint that has nothing to do with weapons or tactics in the narrow sense: the sense of never fully resting, of sleeping in shifts with a rifle within reach, of every unexplained sound after dark carrying a weight that it would not have carried against most other opponents. This is not a minor thing in an army's overall effectiveness. Fatigue degrades judgment, slows reaction time, and erodes the confidence that a defensive position depends on as much as its physical preparation does. An enemy that can attack at any hour forces you to defend at every hour, and a unit that has to defend at every hour for weeks at a time is a unit that arrives at its next daylight engagement already worn down before the first shot is fired. This was, in its way, the quiet second half of the same bet the Americans had made with the markings on their helmets. That earlier bet had been about what happened when a leader fell in the middle of a fight, whether the men below him could keep moving without him. This one was about time itself, about whether an army could sustain the discipline and coordination needed to attack effectively when the sun was not there to help organize it. Both bets depended on the same underlying confidence, that the individual soldier, given a clear purpose and enough trust from above, could be relied upon to function well in conditions that stripped away most of the usual support a hierarchy provides. Night combat removed the officer's ability to see his men. It removed easy communication. It removed observed artillery support and the reassurance of watching your own flanks. What it left was the individual soldier's training, his understanding of what his unit was trying to accomplish, and his willingness to keep moving toward it in the dark. The Americans had spent years building an army that could function under exactly those stripped-down conditions. The value of that investment showed up specifically and repeatedly at night. None of this means German units stopped being effective at night, or that American night attacks always succeeded. They frequently did not. Night operations are unforgiving of error in a way daylight operations are not, because there is no way to see and correct a mistake before it compounds. American units got lost crossing rivers in the dark and drifted into the wrong sector. Friendly units fired on each other more than once. Attacks that looked clean on a map dissolved, in practice, into exactly the kind of confused, fragmented small unit fighting that night combat had always produced for both sides throughout history. German counterattacks at dawn, launched against American positions that had not yet had time to consolidate after a night assault, inflicted real losses and recaptured real ground on more than one occasion. The point is not that darkness was a magic solution the Americans discovered and the Germans never countered. It is that the two armies arrived at the tactic of large-scale night operations from very different starting points, shaped by years of different institutional habits, and that difference showed up in which side could use the tactic more often, more confidently, and with a smaller relative cost when things went wrong. An American platoon leader whose night crossing scattered his unit across an unfamiliar riverbank had been trained to reorganize what he could find, establish what his objectives still allowed him to achieve, and press on with whatever men and equipment had actually made it across, rather than treating the loss of contact with higher command as a reason to stop and wait.
That habit of mind, built over years at places like Fort Benning and tested expensively at places like Kasserine, was worth more in the dark than it was in daylight, because darkness was precisely the condition in which the habit was needed most.
By the final winter of the war, German defensive reports along the Western Front had begun to include a specific, almost weary category of observation: attacks that came without the preparatory signs an alert defender would normally watch for, no buildup of visible daylight activity, no registered artillery preparation announcing what was coming, just the sudden, quiet arrival of American infantry where, by every reasonable expectation of how war worked, there should have been several more hours of night left to rest in. What those defenders were encountering without always having the language for it was the same underlying philosophy that had produced the white stripe on the back of an American officer's helmet, an army built around the conviction that the plan is less important than the ability to keep functioning when the plan runs into the dark, into the confusion, into the moment when no one above you can see what you're seeing and no one is going to tell you what to do next. Night combat simply made that conviction matter more often and more visibly than daylight combat usually did. The German army had built one of the most sophisticated doctrines of individual initiative in the history of modern warfare, and for years that doctrine had made it a formidable and often superior opponent. But doctrine on paper and institutional habit under exhaustion are not always the same thing, and by the last 2 years of the war, a German army stretched thin, increasingly managed from the center, and increasingly worn down by years of fighting, was finding it harder to sustain the very qualities its own tradition had always demanded. The Americans, by contrast, were still building that capacity, still learning unit by unit, campaign by campaign, how to trust the sergeant in the dark field to make the right call. And unlike their opponents, they had the resources, the replacements, and the time to keep getting better at it for the rest of the war. That is the quieter half of the story the helmets only hinted at. The stripe on the back of the helmet was about what happened when the officer fell. The willingness to attack at night again and again in conditions that made every other advantage disappear was about something even more fundamental: whether an army trusted its own soldiers enough to send them into the dark at all, and trusted that whatever happened out there, in the confusion no plan could survive, they would find a way to keep moving toward first light. If this kind of history, the history underneath the history, the institutional habits and quiet decisions that shaped what happened on the ground is what you come here for, subscribe, because this is the conversation this channel tries to have every single time. And if you know someone who'd find this as interesting as you did, share it with them. The stories that change how you see the war are the ones that deserve to travel furthest. The transformation of the American soldier from a green, hesitant conscript in the sands of North Africa to a master of nocturnal infiltration was not an overnight miracle. It was an iterative, often agonizing process of trial and error that forced a massive industrial bureaucracy to rethink the physics of the battlefield. In the interwar years, the United States Army had largely envisioned its future conflicts as grand engineering problems. Victory would be achieved through the precise application of overwhelming firepower, synchronized by strict timetables and mapped out by elaborate logistical networks. It was a philosophy born of the industrial age. Treat war as a factory assembly line where raw materials went in and victory came out. But the terrain of the Mediterranean and Western Europe refused to cooperate with the factory schedule. The Italian landscape, in particular, was a defender's paradise. Steep, jagged ridgelines like those of the Apennines offered the German high command natural fortresses from which they could peer down into the valleys. Every road, every stone farmhouse, and every river bend was perfectly visible to German observers who sat comfortably in stone redoubts with binoculars and field telephones. In daylight, any attempt by American forces to mass for an attack was immediately detected and met with devastatingly accurate artillery fire.
The American advantage in material, the endless crates of shells, the fleets of Sherman tanks, the sky filled with tactical bombers, was effectively neutralized when the men trying to move those assets could not stick their heads above a ditch without drawing sniper fire or a mortar barrage. It was out of this tactical deadlock that the necessity for night operations grew from a desperate gamble into a standard doctrine. If daylight belonged to the observer on the heights, then the Americans would have to conquer the dark. This shift required more than just changing the time on an operation order. It demanded a total overhaul of how individual infantrymen interacted with their environment. In total darkness, the traditional markers of military order vanished. A map was useless without a flashlight, and a flashlight was an invitation to a bullet. A compass became a lifeline, but only if the man holding it knew how to count his paces precisely across broken, cratered ground. American training camps back home and staging areas in Great Britain began to reflect this new reality. Soldiers were subjected to grueling night marches through dense forests and swamps, taught to move without the telltale click of equipment, and trained to interpret the muffled sounds of the night. They learned that a snapped twig could mean an enemy patrol, and that the distinct odor of German tobacco or the particular mechanical whine of a Maybach engine could provide better intelligence than a daylight reconnaissance photograph. The Army was systematically stripping away the sensory cushions of modern life, forcing its men to rely on primal instincts that had largely been forgotten since the frontier era. Yet the mechanical challenges remained immense. How do you keep a company of 200 men moving in the same direction through a pitch-black forest without losing cohesion? The answer lay in low-tech, improvisational solutions. Men tied white strips of cloth to the backs of their helmets, a precursor to the painted stripes used by officers, so the man behind them had a visual anchor to follow. Squads moved in tight single-file lines, sometimes literally holding on to the web gear of the soldier in front of them to avoid drifting apart. Signals were reduced to the simplest possible forms: a double click of a handheld cricket noisemaker, a specific whistle code, or the whispered password that changed every midnight. The American Army was learning to embrace the friction of the dark, transforming what had once been considered an insurmountable obstacle into a protective shroud.
For the German defenders, this American adaptation was not merely a tactical annoyance, it was a psychological assault that struck at the core of their military culture. The German army pridefully traced its lineage back to Frederiциan and Prussian traditions, which emphasized decisive, aggressive maneuver, the Bewegungskrieg, or war of movement. This doctrine placed a premium on speed, bold operational strokes, and the exploitation of flanks in daylight, where the brilliance of a commander's eye, Fingerspitzengefühl, could alter the course of an entire campaign. The Germans were masters of the counterattack. Their doctrine dictated that whenever a position was lost, it must be retaken immediately before the enemy could consolidate. However, the American reliance on night attacks fundamentally disrupted this rhythm. When an American battalion slipped across a river or through a gap in the line at 2 in the morning, they did not immediately seek a decisive battle. Instead, they dug in. They used the remaining hours of darkness to construct deeply revetted machine gun positions, lay tactical wire, and establish communications with their own heavy artillery. When the sun rose and the German High Command ordered the customary immediate counterattack, the German infantry did not find a fluid, disorganized enemy caught in the open. Instead, they ran headlong into a wall of interlocking fields of fire, backed by an American artillery apparatus that now had the daylight visibility it needed to rain thousands of shells onto the German assembly areas. This inversion of roles deeply frustrated German officers.
In their after-action reports, they frequently complained about the uncanny and unsoldierly nature of American tactics. The Americans, they argued, were refusing to fight a proper war of maneuver. Instead, they were using the darkness to bypass the hard shell of German defenses, only to fight from behind fortified positions once daylight returned. It was a strategy that weaponized the American abundance of ammunition and automatic weapons, turning every night attack into a grim one-way trap for the defenders. Furthermore, the physical toll on the German soldier was catastrophic. By 1944, the German army on the Western Front was plagued by a severe shortage of manpower. Units remained on the line for weeks, sometimes months, without relief. In a traditional environment, the night provided a brief respite, a time to eat hot food brought up from the rear, tend to the wounded, and catch a few hours of fitful sleep. But with the constant threat of American night incursions, the line could never relax. Every rustle of grass, every distant cough, and every shadow cast by the moon became a potential catastrophe. German squad leaders had to keep their men in a state of constant, exhausting alertness. Listening posts had to be pushed out into no man's land, exposing the men inside them to sudden capture or elimination by American patrols. The lack of sleep accumulated like a toxic sludge in the minds of the defenders, dulling their reflexes, eroding their morale, and making them increasingly prone to panic when the inevitable midnight assault finally arrived.
The disparity in how the two armies managed the darkness was also deeply rooted in their contrasting logistical realities. Night operations are incredibly resource-intensive. To sustain an attack in the dark, an army requires massive quantities of specialized equipment that must be manufactured, transported, and distributed to the frontline troops. Here, the American industrial colossus provided a decisive edge that Berlin could not hope to match. Consider the simple matter of illumination. An army attacking at night must be able to see its immediate objectives without revealing its own positions to the wider battlefield. The Americans solved this problem through the lavish use of mortar and artillery-fired illumination flares. During a night assault, American chemical mortar battalions would maintain a continuous schedule of star shells over German positions, blinding the defenders and silhouetting their bunkers while the attacking American infantry advanced through the shadows below. If artillery flares were insufficient, the Americans brought up massive anti-aircraft searchlights, bouncing their powerful beams off the low clouds to create a surreal ambient glow known as artificial moonlight. This technique illuminated the terrain just enough for American drivers to bring up ammunition trucks and tanks, while keeping the German positions shrouded in a disorienting haze. The German army, by contrast, was operating under a regime of severe scarcity. Flares and signal rockets were strictly rationed, and German gunners often hesitated to fire illumination shells for fear of drawing immediate, overwhelming counter-battery fire from American long-range artillery. When German positions were bypassed in the dark, they had no artificial moonlight to help them locate the intruders. They were left to peer blindly into the dark, relying on primitive trip flares that were easily spotted and avoided by well-trained American scouts. An even critical advantage lay in the realm of communications. The American Army was the most radio-centric military force in the world. The ubiquitous SCR-300 backpack radio and the handheld SCR-536 walkie-talkie allowed American platoon leaders and company commanders to maintain constant vocal contact during a night advance. If a squad became lost in a draw, the sergeant could simply radio his lieutenant for guidance. If an enemy machine gun opened up from the darkness, a forward observer could immediately voice call a precise target coordinate to a battery miles to the rear. For the German defense, communication in the dark was a nightmare of severed wires and dead runners. The German army relied heavily on landline field telephones for tactical communication. American artillery bombardments routinely chewed beef wires to pieces, and during a night attack, German commanders often found themselves completely isolated from their subordinate units within the first 20 minutes of the engagement.
Runners sent into the darkness to gather information or deliver orders frequently vanished, either captured by infiltrating Americans or lost in the labyrinth of the nighttime battlefield. The German High Command was trying to fight a modern, high-speed war using 19th-century communication methods, and the darkness exposed this vulnerability with brutal clarity.
The true crucible of the American night doctrine, however, was not the flat coastal plains of Anzio or the wide waters of the Rhine, but the claustrophobic, booby-trapped hedgerow country of Normandy, the Bocage. Here, the German army had turned every tiny sunken road and earthen bank into a deadly defensive labyrinth. In daylight, the Americans found themselves slaughtered in the narrow lanes where hidden German anti-tank guns and MG-42 machine guns could sweep an entire field the moment a Sherman tank pushed through a gap. It was in the Bocage that the American infantry truly weaponized the night patrol. These were not the massive divisional assaults of the later campaigns, but small, lethal operations executed by 12-man squads who crept into the hedgerows under the cover of midnight. Their objective was simple: to locate the exact positions of the German machine gun nests that had pinned them down during the day, eliminate them with knives, grenades, and submachine guns, and slip back to their own lines before dawn. These small unit night actions required a level of cold-blooded discipline that tested the limits of human endurance. In the absolute darkness of the hedgerows, combat occurred at distances of a few feet. American soldiers learned to recognize the distinct metallic clack of a German Mauser bolt and the tearing cloth sound of the MG-42 machine gun. They learned to move with their weapons cleared of safety catches, ready to fire from the hip at the first sign of a foreign silhouette. The fighting was feral, chaotic, and deeply personal. It was a war of sudden bursts of fire, the concussive blast of grenades in confined spaces, and long, agonizing silences where men lay paralyzed in the mud, listening to the breathing of an enemy who might be only 3 feet away on the other side of an earthen bank. For the German soldiers holding these positions, the hedgerows ceased to be a defensive shield and became a psychological prison. They knew that the darkness belonged to the Americans. German veterans of the Eastern Front, who had survived the massive human wave day attacks of the Red Army, found themselves uniquely unnerved by the silent, predatory efficiency of the American night patrols. They began to realize that the Americans were not just relying on their industrial machinery and their artillery. They were developing a lethal individual competency in close-quarters night fighting that challenged the German assumption of tactical superiority. The American sergeant was no longer a civilian in uniform who could be easily outmaneuvered. He had become a professional hunter who used the dark to balance the scales. As the war pushed into the autumn of 1944 and the winter of 1945, the strategic implications of this tactical adaptation became unmistakable. The German army was running out of space, time, and men, and their inability to counter the American mastery of the night was accelerating their collapse. During the retreat across France, German commanders attempted to use the night hours to move their remaining armor and motorized transport columns away from the devastating attention of the Allied air forces. In previous years, this would have been a safe maneuver. But now, American night-flying reconnaissance aircraft, equipped with primitive radar and high-intensity flares, patrolled the dark skies, spotting the heat signatures and headlights of the retreating columns and directing heavy artillery fire or night fighter bombers onto the choked roads. Even when the Germans managed to establish a stable defensive line, such as along the formidable West Wall, the Americans used the night to bypass their fortifications entirely. The Siegfried line, with its concrete pillboxes, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, and deep minefields, had been designed to repel a daylight assault by standard military formations. The firing slits of the pillboxes were positioned to cover specific daylight avenues of approach, and the minefields were mapped out to force attackers into pre-registered killing zones.
But an American infantry division attacking at night did not move down the roads or across the open fields in neat, predictable formations. They moved in small, dispersed groups, guided by engineers who used non-magnetic brass tools to silently probe the mud from mines, creating narrow, safe pathways through the hazards in total darkness. American squads would slip past the concrete pillboxes entirely, ignoring the firing slits that could see nothing in the dark, and occupy the high ground behind the fortifications. When the German defenders inside the bunkers woke to the first light of dawn, they frequently discovered that they were completely surrounded, their supply lines cut, and the guns they had spent months preparing to fire were pointing at an empty field, while American troops looked down on them from the ridges behind. This tactical reality created a profound sense of claustrophobia within the German high command. They realized that their entire defensive strategy, which relied on holding fixed geographic lines and hitting the enemy with sudden daylight counterstrokes, was being systematically dismantled by an opponent who treated the battlefield not as a series of lines on a map, but as a fluid, three-dimensional space that could be penetrated at any hour. The very concept of a stable front line was disappearing, replaced by a chaotic patchwork of isolated strongpoints surrounded by a darkness that was filled with American steel.
The ultimate expression of this institutional confidence occurred during the final frantic months of the war inside Germany itself. By the spring of 1945, the German army was a broken instrument, its ranks filled with elderly men from the Volkssturm and teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, stiffened by a dwindling corps of exhausted veterans. Yet out of desperation, these fragmented units still fought with a feral intensity, utilizing the ruins of German cities and the dense forests of the homeland to inflict heavy casualties on the advancing Allies. In this final phase, the American reliance on night attacks became the definitive tool for breaking the last remnants of German resistance without sacrificing thousands of American lives in costly urban assaults. In cities like Frankfurt, Nuremberg, and Stuttgart, the German defenders attempted to turn every street corner and basement into a fortress. In daylight, an advance down a city street was a lethal enterprise, with hidden snipers, Panzerfaust teams, and concealed machine guns covering every intersection. The Americans responded by turning out the lights. They would halt their daylight advance at dusk, bring up their heavy artillery, and spend the night systematically pounding the German strongpoints, not with random bombardments, but with highly coordinated radar-directed fire that targeted specific buildings. Simultaneously, small teams of infantry, equipped with early night vision devices like the Snooperscope, a primitive, heavy infrared sight mounted on M1 carbines, would slip through the cellars and sewer systems of the ruined German cities. These early night vision devices were clumsy, required massive battery packs carried on the soldier's back, and had a range of only a few dozen yards. But in the tight, ruined confines of a destroyed German city, a few dozen yards of visibility in total darkness was an immense, decisive advantage. An American soldier looking through the infrared scope could see the heat signature of a German sniper hiding in a dark window, or a machine gun crew assembling in a basement entryway long before the Germans were even aware that an American was in the street. The German defenders were literally blind against an enemy who could see in the dark, and the psychological impact of this technological disparity was absolute. German prisoners captured in these final urban battles often expressed a sense of profound horror at the realization that even the absolute darkness of a locked basement or a deep trench could no longer protect them from American fire. The American army had not just conquered the night, they had colonized it, turning it into a space where they could hunt with impunity, while their opponents were left to wait helplessly for the blow to fall.
When the history of the Second World War is written in the grand terms of vast industrial output, strategic bombing campaigns, and massive encirclements,
The quiet revolution in night combat is often relegated to a footnote. We remember the grand daylight images of the war, the thousands of landing craft hitting the beaches of Normandy under a bright June sun, the columns of Sherman tanks racing across the sunny plains of France, the massive daylight armadas of B-17 bombers filling the skies over Germany. But the war was frequently decided in the hours between those grand images, in the mud and the dark, where the cameras could not look. The ability of the American Army to transition from a force that was terrified of the dark into a force that used the night as its primary tactical weapon was one of the most significant and least understood factors in the rapid defeat of the German army in the West. It was an achievement that reflected the unique character of the society that produced that army. The American Army was an institution built on a profound trust in the individual citizen soldier. It was an army that assumed its men, if properly trained and equipped, could be trusted to think for themselves, to adapt to chaos, and to maintain their discipline even when the structure of the military hierarchy was stripped away by the darkness. The German High Command, for all its brilliant tactical doctrine and its centuries of military tradition, had ultimately built an army that depended on the structure, the order, and the direction that flowed from the top down. When the darkness tore that structure apart, the German defense came apart with it. The German defenders who went to sleep at Anzio, or who watched the quiet waters of the Rhine in the spring of 1945, learned a lesson that went far beyond the mechanics of camouflage, flares, or radio communication. They learned that they were fighting an enemy who had looked into the absolute chaos, the terrifying isolation, and the profound friction of the nighttime battlefield, and had decided that they were not afraid of it. They had learned that the American Army was willing to send its sons into the dark, confident that they would find a way to keep moving forward, squad by squad, sergeant by sergeant, until the sun rose on a battlefield that they had already won.